The cold morning air cut through every layer of clothing he had, leaving him shivering as he walked through the empty streets. His shoes were worn, the soles barely holding together, and his coat had seen better days, but it was all he had to shield him from the bitter wind. The city seemed alive but distant, full of people rushing to work, to meetings, to lives that felt untouchable to someone like him. Every glance he received was fleeting, often indifferent, sometimes filled with quiet judgment. He knew he was invisible, and yet he moved, searching for something, anything that might help him survive the day. He had been a soldier once, a man who had served his country with pride. The uniform he wore had once meant honor, respect, and a sense of purpose. Now it was just a memory, a shadow of the life he had lost. The streets were harsh, and he had learned to move quietly, to avoid drawing attention to himself. People didn't see him as someone who had given years of his life to something greater than themselves. They saw him as a homeless man, a beggar, someone to pass by without thought. Breakfast was a constant struggle. Some days he found nothing but a stale piece of bread in a trash can, and other days a kind stranger might hand him a sandwich. But more often than not, people mocked him, called him names, or pretended he wasn't there at all. The ridicule stung in ways that were harder than the hunger or the cold. It wasn't just his body that was in pain. It was the constant erosion of his dignity. Despite everything, he kept moving. Today, he wandered farther than usual, past the familiar streets lined with closed shops and empty alleyways, searching for something different, something that might break the endless monotony of survival. His steps eventually led him to a subway station, a place where the noise of trains and people created a strange sense of anonymity. He could sit there without anyone really noticing, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to make his day a little easier. At the corner of the station, tucked near the entrance, stood a piano. Its wood was scratched, the keys a little worn, but it was intact, a quiet sentinel in the middle of chaos. He approached it slowly, his eyes tracing the familiar shape. Music had always been a part of his life, even before the army, even before the streets. The piano was a reminder of who he had been, of talent and passion and moments where life had felt alive with possibility. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, testing them, feeling the cool surface beneath his hands. The notes responded, imperfect but present, and a small smile crept across his face. For a brief moment, the hunger and cold faded, replaced by something that felt like hope. He remembered playing in concert halls, the applause, the way music could fill a room and touch people in ways words never could. Those memories were bittersweet now, distant echoes of a life that seemed impossible to return to. He lingered there for a while, listening to the faint sounds of the subway, the hum of people and trains, the occasional laughter that floated down from above. Then, with a deep breath, he made a decision. If he wanted to eat today, he would have to do something bold. He would have to ask, and he would have to hope that someone would listen. The words formed in his mind, simple but carrying the weight of his desperation. "Can I play for food?" Taking a step back, he waited, watching as commuters hurried past, their faces focused on destinations and schedules. Some glanced at him, some ignored him, and some looked with mild curiosity. He could feel the judgment already, the unspoken words that passed through their minds, questioning why a grown man would sit at a piano in the subway station asking for help. He swallowed the lump in his throat and approached anyway, pulling a small, battered hat from his coat to place at the base of the piano. "Can I play for food?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach those nearby. A few people paused, looking at him with varying expressions. Some smirked, clearly amused by what they assumed was a pathetic act. Others ignored him, stepping around as if he were invisible. One person dropped a coin, and he nodded gratefully, tucking it into the hat. It wasn't much, but it was something. Every small gesture mattered when the day had been long and cold. He sat down and placed his hands on the keys. At first, the notes were hesitant, shaky, as if his fingers were testing whether they still remembered the language of music. But then, slowly, a melody began to form, simple and soft, filling the empty station with sound. It wasn't grand, not yet, but it was enough to make a few heads turn. People stopped, some out of curiosity, some out of the recognition of talent that had not faded despite the years and hardships. For a moment he forgot the cold, the hunger, the weight of the world pressing down on him. He was just a man playing piano, and for a little while that was enough. The music carried him, lifted him, reminded him of who he was beneath the tattered coat and worn shoes. It reminded him that even in the darkest circumstances, he had something to give, something beautiful that could not be taken away. Passers-by began to slow, some dropping coins or bills into the hat. A small crowd formed, drawn not just by the novelty of a man playing in a subway station, but by the undeniable skill in his fingers. The way each note seemed to tell a story of struggle and resilience. Whispers spread among them, speculations about who he was, why he was there, what story lay behind the music. None of them knew the truth yet, but they could sense that he was more than he appeared. And he could feel it too. The music was a bridge, connecting him to people who otherwise might never have noticed him. He didn't need words. The piano spoke for him. Each chord, each delicate note, carried fragments of his life, of the years he had fought, the losses he had endured, and the hope he still held onto despite everything. It was a language that transcended judgment and ridicule, a reminder that talent and humanity existed even in those whom society had discarded. He paused occasionally, catching his breath, glancing at the small pile of coins and bills in the hat. It wasn't enough to bring him a full meal, but it was a start. He could survive another day, and maybe tomorrow someone would be there who could see past his appearance to the person beneath. And perhaps, if he played well enough, they might listen, truly listen, to the music that had always been a part of him. The sun began to rise higher, casting light through the station windows, illuminating the piano and the man sitting before it. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope, fragile but persistent. The world around him was still harsh, still full of indifference and ridicule. But for a few precious hours, it seemed possible that someone might see him, hear him, and understand. And so, he played, letting the music carry him through the morning. Each note a declaration that even in the lowest moments, beauty could not be silenced. People continued to watch, some in awe, some in quiet contemplation, others still uncertain what to make of this man who had emerged from the streets to speak through the piano. And he continued to play, not for fame or recognition, but for survival, for dignity, for the small reminder that he was still alive and still capable of touching hearts, even in the most unlikely of places. The music flowed from him naturally, effortlessly, as if the years of hardship had sharpened rather than dulled his talent. It was a performance without an audience, yet it mattered more than any concert hall ever had. As the morning grew busier, he felt the first warmth of human attention that wasn't ridicule. Coins and small bills filled the hat, not much, but enough to buy a simple meal. More importantly, people were beginning to notice him not as a homeless man, but as someone with skill, with a story hidden behind tired eyes and ragged clothes. For the first time in months, he felt a small spark of pride, the knowledge that even in his current state, he could command respect through his music. The day stretched on, and he continued to play, drawing more attention, more whispers and more curiosity. And in his mind, a quiet thought began to form, almost like a whisper to himself. Perhaps this piano, this small corner of the subway station, could be the beginning of something more. Perhaps it could remind the world, and remind himself, that a man was never truly lost as long as he still had something to give, something that came from his heart and hands. And so, he played on, each note carrying the weight of his journey, each melody a small beacon of hope in a world that often refused to see him. The ridicule, the laughter, the indifference. It all faded into the background, drowned out by the sound of music that was unmistakably his own. In that moment, among the rushing crowd and the hum of the city, he was not a homeless veteran, not a shadow of the past. He was a musician, a storyteller, and, most importantly, a human being who had something to offer, no matter how harsh the world had become. The morning had slowly turned into midday, and the crowd in the subway station had grown larger. People People who had once walked past him without a glance were now slowing down, drawn to the gentle melodies that seemed to float effortlessly through the space. He could feel their eyes on him, but it no longer felt heavy with judgment. Instead, there was curiosity, a subtle recognition that something about him was different, something worth listening to. He played with care, each note deliberate, weaving a story of struggle, survival, and hidden talent. After a few songs, he paused and wiped the sweat from his brow. His hands were still capable, though stiff from hours of tension and cold. He glanced at the small hat at his feet, now containing more coins than he had imagined. It was not enough to change his situation entirely, but it was a start. The small amount of money was a small victory, a sign that the world had not entirely forgotten him. Even in his current state, he could survive a little longer, and maybe, just maybe, he could find another way to rebuild. He noticed a young woman in the crowd, leaning against a pillar, her phone recording his performance. She had an expression of awe on her face, as if she could feel the depth of emotion behind each note. Her curiosity was different from the mocking he was used to. It was sincere, and it reminded him that not all people were quick to judge. Nearby, a man with a briefcase was tapping his foot in time with the music, clearly enjoying the rhythm and complexity. It was these small moments that gave him courage to continue. Taking a deep breath, he decided to speak to the people around him. "I haven't always been here," he said softly, his voice carrying over the noise of the station. "I used to play in concert halls. I've traveled, performed, and shared music with people who knew how to listen. Life has a way of changing things, and here I am today playing for food." The words hung in the air, and a few people exchanged glances. Some eyes widened in surprise, while others looked skeptical. It was one thing to see a man playing piano in the subway, but it was another to hear that he had once been a professional musician. A murmur spread through the crowd, people whispering to one another, sharing the revelation like a secret. He could sense the shift in energy, a subtle respect beginning to replace the initial amusement. Despite this, there were still those who mocked him. A couple of teenagers laughed and whispered, pointing at the coins in his hat, clearly finding humor in what they assumed was a desperate performance. He felt the old sting of ridicule, the familiar ache of being underestimated and belittled. But he did not let it stop him. Instead, he let his fingers dance over the keys, pouring his experience and skill into the music. Every note was a reply to the skepticism, a silent challenge that could not be ignored. As the music continued, more people began to gather. Some had never seen someone play with such depth and precision, especially not on a subway piano. Children stopped, mesmerized by the sound, their parents holding them close as they listened. One elderly man stepped closer, leaning on his cane, and nodded appreciatively. He could see the recognition in the man's eyes, an understanding that talent and life experience cannot be erased by circumstances. Hours passed in this rhythm, and though his body ached from the cold and from sitting so long, he did not stop. Every note was a thread connecting him to the people around him, a silent story that spoke louder than words ever could. The hat at his feet slowly filled, not just with money, but with tokens of respect, small gestures from people who finally saw him for more than the rags he wore and the streets he walked. Some offered sandwiches, a warm drink, or simply a nod of approval. Each gesture was a reminder that humanity could still exist even in the harshest places. He noticed a man in a suit standing near the edge of the crowd, watching intently. There was no laughter, no smirk, only a focused gaze that made him feel both nervous and encouraged. Perhaps this was someone who could understand, someone who could recognize the years of practice, the passion, the discipline that had shaped him. It was rare to encounter such attention without judgment, and he found himself playing with even more care, as if each note could communicate what words could not. During a brief pause, he spoke again. "I know it's hard to understand how someone can go from stages to streets. Life doesn't always follow the path we expect. But music doesn't judge. It doesn't care about wealth or clothes or appearances. It only cares about truth." The crowd listened, the murmur of whispers fading into quiet. Some heads nodded, some eyes glistened with emotion. A few people in the back began taking videos, capturing the moment, perhaps hoping to share the story of a man whose talent refused to be hidden by misfortune. He played again, this time with more confidence, his fingers moving swiftly, gracefully, telling stories of sorrow, hope, and resilience through melodies that seemed to touch every listener in a personal way. The hours blurred together as people came and went, but a sense of connection had formed. Strangers who had ignored him in the morning now lingered, captivated by his music, moved by his presence, and challenged by their own assumptions. It was a rare kind of magic, a reminder that even in the lowest moments, human beings could still see, feel, and respond to beauty. Occasionally, he would glance at the hat, now much fuller than it had been, and feel a flicker of relief. He could finally afford a meal, perhaps a warm cup of soup, a small luxury in a day that had begun with nothing. But the real reward was not the coins or bills. It was the attention, the acknowledgement that he still mattered, that he still had something to give. That realization gave him strength to continue, to keep playing, and to keep sharing the story of his life through the music. By mid-afternoon, more people had gathered, drawn not just by the music, but by the story that had begun to spread. Whispers of a veteran who had once been a renowned pianist reached those passing by. Some approached hesitantly, unsure if the tale was true, but curiosity won over skepticism. They listened, they watched, and slowly, respect replaced ridicule. Even those who had laughed in the beginning could not deny the talent, the dedication, and the humanity in front of them. He noticed a woman kneeling to help a small child drop a coin into the hat. Her smile was warm, genuine, and he felt a connection that went beyond words. She didn't need to know his past to understand his present. The music spoke for him, and in that moment, he realized that it wasn't about proving who he had been, but about sharing what he still could offer. Each note, each melody, was a bridge between his world and theirs, a reminder that kindness and appreciation could grow even in unexpected places. As the day wore on, he began to feel the strain in his hands and back, but he refused to stop. Every person who had paused, every child who had watched, every coin that had been placed in the hat was proof that he had not been entirely invisible. People had begun to see him as more than a homeless veteran. They were beginning to see the man behind the coat, the hands behind the music, the story behind the eyes. And in that recognition, he found not just hope, but a sense of purpose. Finally, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the station, he played one last piece before standing and stretching. The crowd had thinned, but many lingered, offering kind words, a handshake, or a smile. The hat was full enough to buy a decent meal, and he knew that for the first time in a long while, he could face the evening with a small sense of security. But more importantly, he had discovered that the world could still respond to the truth of his talent, that ridicule and judgment could be overcome by persistence and honesty. He stood, bowed slightly to the few remaining listeners, and gathered his things. The music had carried him through the day, had opened doors to connection, and had reminded him of his own worth. The ridicule and mockery of strangers had not disappeared entirely, but it had lost its power. In the simple act of playing piano for those willing to listen, he had reclaimed a part of himself that the streets had tried to take away. As he walked out of the subway station, carrying his small hat and the faint echo of music in his mind, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that tomorrow might bring another opportunity, another connection, another chance to be seen for who he really was. And with that thought, he continued forward, knowing that as long as he had music, as long as he could still play, he could find a way to survive, to be heard, and to remind the world that even in the most difficult circumstances, talent, dignity, and humanity could not be hidden. The next morning, the veteran returned to the subway station, carrying only the essentials he had managed to keep with him. The small hat was empty, cleaned from the day before, ready to receive whatever kindness the world might offer. His coat was worn but warm enough for the winter chill, and his hands, though stiff from yesterday's long playing session, were ready to touch the piano keys again. He felt a mixture of hope and fear, uncertain if today would bring ridicule, indifference, or perhaps something unexpected. As he approached the piano, a small crowd was already gathering. Word had spread quietly, carried by people who had seen him the day before. Some were curious to see if the story of the talented veteran was true. Others were drawn simply by the music, wanting to witness the magic of someone who could transform a cold, bustling station into a place of emotion and reflection. He nodded to a few familiar faces and took his place at the piano, fingers hovering above the keys, feeling the comforting weight of possibility in each note. He began softly, allowing the music to grow slowly, filling the station with melody. Today, he wanted to play something different, something that would reach the hearts of those who listened, not just impress their ears. The notes were gentle at first, tender, like a whisper, and then gradually stronger, more confident, carrying emotion with every chord. People stopped in their tracks, some leaning on walls or pillars, others standing close, captivated by the depth of feeling in the music. Even the hurried commuters slowed, their footsteps faltering as the sound took over their attention. A few people began recording, but there was no clamor for likes or shares. The focus was on the music itself. Children clutched their parents' hands, mesmerized by the harmony and the skill in his playing. One man, older, with a quiet air of authority, stood a little apart from the crowd, observing intently. He did not speak, he did not smile, but there was an intensity in his gaze that the veteran recognized. It was the same intensity he had once seen in conductors, critics, and fellow musicians. People who understood that music was not merely entertainment, but a language of life. The veteran played for hours, letting the music flow naturally, as if each note carried fragments of his own story. The crowd grew, not in numbers alone but in attention and respect. People who had mocked him yesterday were now quiet, some whispering to each other, trying to reconcile the image of the man they had ridiculed with the talent they were witnessing. Their laughter, which once felt like daggers, had faded into uncomfortable silence. They could no longer deny the truth of his gift. A young man, likely a college student, approached cautiously, holding a small notebook. He had seen the veteran play before and wanted to know more, to understand the story behind the music. The veteran noticed him and gave a small nod, inviting him to come closer. The student hesitated but finally asked, "Were you always this good? How did you learn to play like that?" The veteran smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and melancholy in his expression. "I played for many years," he said softly. "Before life took me to places I never expected. I played on stages, in concert halls, for people who came to listen. Music has always been my way of speaking when words failed me. It's what kept me going through everything." The young man nodded, fascinated. He could feel the weight behind the words, the lived experience that came with them. It was more than skill. It was a life shaped by both triumph and hardship, and it resonated in every note. The student moved back into the crowd, eager to listen, perhaps hoping to learn something about resilience through observation rather than textbooks. The veteran paused briefly, letting his hands rest on the keys. He looked around at the crowd, the diversity of faces, the mixture of curiosity, admiration, and quiet reflection. He could feel the change in energy, a shift from skepticism to genuine interest. People were beginning to see him not as a homeless man, not as someone to ridicule, but as a person with a story worth hearing, someone with talent that transcended circumstance. Encouraged, he began to play again, this time choosing a complex piece that required full attention, full concentration. His fingers moved gracefully, producing melodies that filled the space with richness and emotion. A few people in the crowd gasped quietly, clearly impressed by the technical skill and the feeling embedded in each chord. Others leaned in, captivated by the story that unfolded through music rather than words. The subway station, usually a place of noise and distraction, had become a small haven of beauty. A woman, elderly and frail, stepped closer, leaning heavily on her cane. She whispered to a companion, "He plays like he has lived every note. It's not just music, it's life itself." The veteran caught the words and nodded slightly, though he did not stop playing. It was rare for someone to articulate what he felt while playing, but it was even rarer to hear it recognized aloud. Her understanding, simple as it was, strengthened him, reminding him that even in the harshest situations, people could see truth if they were willing to look. Hours passed like minutes. People came and went, but many stayed, drawn to the piano and the man who played it. Each time a new person approached, he could sense their initial skepticism, the judgment that society trained them to carry. But every time he played, that skepticism dissolved, replaced by awe, curiosity, and quiet respect. It was a delicate transformation, subtle yet profound, and it filled him with a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. During a brief pause, a young boy dropped a coin into the hat and looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "You're really good," he said simply. The veteran smiled warmly. "Thank you, little one. Keep playing even if it's just for yourself. Music is always worth it." The boy nodded and ran back to his mother, who smiled at him knowingly. Moments like these were small but powerful, a reminder that his music could reach hearts across generations, that talent and kindness could inspire even the youngest. Suddenly, a man in a business suit approached, this time stepping closer than before. There was a recognition in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, as if he had seen the veteran's name somewhere, or perhaps had heard of his past reputation. The veteran felt a nervous twinge, unsure what would come next. Would this be another person who judged him for his current state, or someone who might finally see the truth behind the music? The man stood silently for a moment, then spoke, his voice low but firm. "You play beautifully. Have you performed professionally?" The veteran hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "Many years ago in concert halls with audiences who came to listen. Life changed, and now I play here, hoping someone might notice." The man studied him, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Then finally he smiled slightly. "I think it's time people did notice. Your music deserves to be heard by more than just passers-by in a subway station." The veteran felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years: validation, recognition, and a cautious hope. It was not the money, nor the attention, but the acknowledgement that his life, his talent, and his resilience mattered. He played on, now with renewed energy and purpose. The crowd sensed the change, their curiosity deepening into admiration. The notes seemed to carry more than before, telling stories of struggle, of perseverance, and of a life that had refused to be erased. Every chord was a testament to his journey, and every pause held the weight of experiences that shaped him. People were no longer just listening. They were witnessing the unfolding of a life told through music. As the afternoon waned, the station had transformed. What had been a place of indifference and haste was now filled with warmth, attention, and respect. People lingered, talking softly, listening, and reflecting on what they had seen. Some left quietly, inspired. Others stayed, unable to tear themselves away from the music. And in the middle of it all, the veteran continued to play, undeterred by fatigue, driven by the knowledge that his story was finally being heard. By the time he paused, stretching his aching hands and shoulders, the hat was filled more than he could have imagined. Coins, bills, and small tokens of appreciation were nestled together, but the true gift was the acknowledgement, the connection, the recognition that even in his current circumstances, he could touch lives and remind people of the humanity that often goes unnoticed. He stood, letting the final notes linger in the air, and looked around at the crowd. Faces filled with surprise, admiration, and quiet reflection met his eyes. Some nodded in respect, some smiled warmly, and a few approached to thank him personally. For the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen, not as a homeless veteran, not as a man fallen on hard times, but as a musician, as a storyteller, as someone whose life had value and whose talent could not be diminished by circumstance. As he gathered his belongings and prepared to leave, he felt the first flickers of what might become hope. Today had been different. The ridicule, though not entirely gone, had lost its sting. People had begun to notice, to understand, to appreciate. And in that recognition, he found a strength that he had thought long lost. Music, he realized, was not just a way to survive. It was a way to reclaim himself, to bridge the gap between the life he had and the life he might still build. With that thought, he walked out of the subway station, leaving the piano behind for another day, another story, another chance to touch hearts. And as he stepped into the bustling streets, he felt the quiet promise that perhaps, just perhaps, the world was ready to listen, to recognize, and to honor the man who had never stopped playing, no matter how harsh the journey had become. The following day, the veteran returned once more to the subway station, feeling a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The previous days had been unusual, filled with music, attention, and a small sense of connection he hadn't experienced in months. But today, he sensed that something bigger was about to happen, though he could not have predicted the way the day would unfold. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his hands flexing over the keys of the piano as he approached, ready to play. As he sat down, a larger crowd was already forming, drawn not only by the sound but by the story that had begun to circulate. People remembered the man from yesterday, the veteran who played with skill and heart, and they wanted to see more, to witness for themselves what had already sparked curiosity and admiration. Some faces were familiar, nodding in recognition, while new people leaned in to catch the first notes, sensing that this was more than a performance. It was an experience. He began to play, slowly at first, allowing the music to build gradually, capturing the attention of everyone in the station. His hands moved with confidence, each note deliberate, telling stories of resilience, sorrow, and hope. The melodies were rich, full of emotion, and they seemed to transform the very air around him. People stopped in their tracks, their conversations fading, replaced by the quiet reverence that comes when music speaks directly to the soul. As he played, he noticed a man standing near the edge of the crowd, observing with intensity. There was a sense of familiarity in the way he looked, as if he knew the man playing or had heard stories about him before. The veteran felt a flicker of recognition as well, but he continued to focus on the music, letting the notes convey what words could not. There was something electric about the air, a tension that suggested something important was about to be revealed. A woman, holding her child, whispered to a companion, "I've never seen someone play like that. It's almost as if the piano is a part of him, carrying every memory, every feeling." The veteran caught the words and nodded slightly, his eyes still on the keys. He knew she could sense the truth that he had been carrying quietly for years, the skill that had once earned him applause in grand halls and the respect of audiences who came to listen with their hearts. He continued, allowing the music to rise and fall, to twist and turn, each phrase more compelling than the last. The crowd grew, a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and quiet awe. Even those who had mocked him in the past began to watch in silence, unable to ignore the depth and complexity of his talent. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a bridge, connecting him to people who had once dismissed him, showing them that there was much more to the man before them than appearances suggested. During a pause between pieces, the man he had noticed earlier stepped forward, his expression both cautious and intrigued. He spoke with a quiet authority. "Excuse me, do you play professionally?" The veteran looked up, meeting his gaze. For a moment, he considered deflecting, but something in the man's tone made him pause. It was not judgment or curiosity alone, it was understanding, recognition. "Yes," he replied softly. "I have played professionally, in concert halls and theaters. But life has a way of changing direction." The man's eyes widened slightly, and he took a step back, a mixture of surprise and respect on his face. He whispered to someone nearby, and soon a ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. People were beginning to realize that the man who had played so beautifully and passionately in the subway was no ordinary street performer. The revelation sparked astonishment, disbelief, and admiration, replacing the skepticism that had lingered until now. A few reporters who had been passing by began to take notice. Phones and cameras emerged, capturing the scene, the music, and the reactions of the crowd. The veteran continued to play, letting the story unfold naturally, without seeking attention or fame. The music itself was enough to command respect, to reveal the truth hidden behind the tattered coat and worn shoes. Each note, Each phrase carried the weight of experience, the precision of years of training, and the emotion of a life fully lived, even in hardship. The crowd became hushed, captivated by the unfolding story. People exchanged whispered comments, some recalling the veteran's name from past performances, others marveling at the contrast between his current situation and the skill he displayed. The ridicule of the past seemed distant now, replaced by genuine admiration. Even those who had doubted him, who had laughed or walked past with indifference, could not deny what they were witnessing. The veteran paused, letting his hands rest briefly on the keys. He looked around at the faces in the crowd, some familiar, some new, all drawn in by the music and the story it told. He realized that this was more than just playing for food or survival. This was a moment of reclamation, a chance to reveal who he truly was, and to remind the world that talent, dignity, and humanity cannot be erased by circumstance. A young man stepped forward, holding a notebook. "I've heard of you," he said softly, awe in his voice. "You're a piano legend. People have talked about your concerts, your music. Is it really you?" The veteran nodded, a quiet smile touching his lips. "It is," he said, "but that life feels far away now. Music has always been with me, and it's what keeps me going." The crowd gasped quietly, some exchanging astonished glances. The revelation spread quickly, transforming the energy in the station. People who had mocked him, ignored him, or doubted him now looked with newfound respect. Children who had watched him play were now listening with deeper attention, understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The veteran's past and present had collided in a way that was both humbling and inspiring. The man in the suit, who had observed him for much of the morning, stepped forward once more. "You should not be here alone playing for coins. Your talent deserves more than a subway station. People need to hear you, see you, and experience your music as it was meant to be shared." The veteran felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and cautious hope. He had been surviving, day by day, unnoticed, but now the world was beginning to see him for who he truly was. The music continued, each note richer, more powerful, more alive than before. The crowd listened, rapt, their eyes and ears attuned to the story unfolding through sound. It was no longer just a performance. It was a revelation, a declaration of resilience, a testament to the enduring spirit of a man who had refused to let life's hardships silence him. People recorded, shared, and marveled. But the true impact was in the connection forged between the veteran and the audience, a bridge built with every melody. By afternoon, the station had transformed. What had begun as a place of indifference and haste was now filled with quiet reverence, admiration, and reflection. People who had laughed or ignored him before now whispered in awe, nodding in recognition and respect. The veteran, though tired, felt a profound sense of fulfillment. His story, once hidden behind layers of hardship, had begun to emerge through the language he knew best. He played on, letting each piece tell a chapter of his life. Memories of past performances, victories, losses, and sacrifices intertwined with the reality of his present. The music spoke not just to the ears but to the hearts of those listening, conveying a depth of experience that words alone could never capture. It was a living testament to the fact that even when life strips away comfort and security, the essence of who a person is can never be erased. As the day wore on, people began to approach him, offering words of encouragement, gestures of respect, and expressions of gratitude. Some left coins or bills, but many simply nodded, smiled, or thanked him for sharing his music. The veteran realized that the true gift was not the money. It was the acknowledgement, the recognition that he still had value, that his talent, his life experience, and his humanity were worthy of attention. By evening, the crowd had dispersed, but the energy lingered, a sense of transformation that could not be undone. The veteran gathered his few belongings, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment he had not felt in years. The revelation of who he truly was had changed everything. The ridicule, the indifference, and the invisibility that had haunted him were replaced by admiration, respect, and a renewed sense of purpose. He left the subway station with a lighter heart, carrying not only the small earnings from the day but also the knowledge that he had reclaimed a piece of himself. Music had once again proven to be more than a skill. It was a lifeline, a bridge, and a means of connecting with the world in a way that transcended circumstance. The journey ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he felt seen, valued, and ready to embrace whatever opportunities might come his way. The morning sun filtered through the subway windows as the veteran returned once again to the familiar station. Today, the crowd was not just strangers or curious onlookers. There were reporters, passers-by who had heard the story, and even a few musicians who had come to witness the man they now knew was a piano legend. He carried a small bundle with his few belongings, the hat at his feet ready for donations, but the anticipation in the air suggested that money was no longer the primary concern. Today felt different. Today felt like a turning point. He sat at the piano and placed his hands on the keys. There was no hesitation this time, no self-doubt. The music flowed effortlessly, richer, fuller, more alive than ever. Every note carried emotion, telling stories of hardship, perseverance, and the quiet strength that had brought him here. The crowd listened in rapt attention, some standing in awe, others recording quietly, capturing the moment that felt both ordinary and extraordinary at once. A woman in the crowd whispered to her companion, "He's not just playing, he's speaking with the piano. You can feel everything he's been through." The veteran caught her words, though he did not stop playing. Each note was a bridge, connecting him to people who had once dismissed him, who had once ignored or ridiculed him. Now, they were part of his story, witnesses to the life he had lived and the talent that had never faded. As he continued, he noticed the man in the suit from the previous day approaching again. This time, he was accompanied by a few others, all with expressions of admiration and curiosity. The veteran paused briefly, allowing the music to fade gently. The man spoke, his voice calm and encouraging. "We want to help you. People need to hear your music in the proper setting. Would you consider performing somewhere where your talent can truly be appreciated?" The veteran looked up, surprise and cautious hope mixing in his expression. He had been surviving day to day for so long that the idea of recognition, of a real opportunity, felt almost unreal. Yet, the sincerity in the man's tone was undeniable. He nodded slowly, a small smile forming. "I think it's time," he said quietly. "Time to let the music speak in the way it was meant to." The crowd began to murmur, realizing that something significant was unfolding. The man in the suit introduced himself as someone connected to a local music venue and suggested organizing a special performance to showcase the veteran's talent. The idea was met with excitement and applause, and the veteran felt a warmth he had not known in years. It was not the recognition alone, but the acknowledgement that his life and skill still mattered, that people valued the art he had preserved through hardship. He continued to play, letting the news settle in his mind, weaving the feeling of hope into the melodies. People around him listened with quiet reverence, understanding that they were witnessing a moment of transformation. Some approached to place coins and bills into the hat, not out of necessity but as a gesture of respect and admiration. Others simply stood, listening, feeling, and connecting with the music in a way that words could not convey. Throughout the day, more people came to the station, drawn by the story spreading through whispers, social media, and word of mouth. Each new listener added energy and warmth to the space, creating a community united by the music and the story of the veteran who had once been invisible. Children stopped to watch, parents explained gently about the importance of talent and perseverance, and strangers nodded to one another, sharing a quiet acknowledgement of the moment's significance. By late afternoon, the man in the suit returned with more details. A music hall was willing to host a performance, giving the veteran a chance to play before an audience that could appreciate every note. The veteran felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The idea of performing again in a formal setting was daunting after years on the streets, but it was also a chance to reclaim a piece of his life he had thought lost forever. He nodded in agreement, and the arrangements began to take shape. The day continued with him playing, people gathering, reporters asking questions, and a sense of purpose guiding every movement. The music became more than survival. It became a celebration, a testament to resilience, a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, talent and dignity could not be erased. Each chord, each phrase, carried not just sound but meaning, telling the story of a life that had endured hardship, ridicule, and isolation but had not been defeated. As evening approached, the veteran finally paused, stretching his hands and shoulders. The crowd clapped softly, not for the performance alone, but for the journey he represented. People came forward, offering words of encouragement, smiles of admiration, and gestures of support. For the first time in a long while, he felt fully seen, fully recognized, not just for his music, but for the human being who had persevered through so much. He packed his few belongings and left the station, carrying the hat, the small earnings, and a heart full of hope. He walked through the streets with a sense of purpose, knowing that tomorrow would bring a new chapter, one in which his talent could be shared with a broader audience and his story could inspire others. The music had guided him here, but the recognition, the understanding, and the opportunity now formed a bridge to a life that had seemed impossible to reclaim. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Rehearsals were arranged, invitations sent, and the veteran prepared for his first official performance in years. The community that had gathered around him in the subway continued to support him, some attending the performance, others spreading the word. The excitement was palpable, and he felt both anxious and exhilarated. Each day, he practiced, letting the music guide him, finding confidence in the skill and passion that had never left him. When the night of the performance arrived, the hall was filled with people who had heard the story, and those who simply wanted to experience the music of someone who had overcome incredible odds. The veteran walked onto the stage, the piano awaiting him, and he felt a calm determination. The lights, the audience, and the space were different from the subway, but the music was the same. It belonged to him and he was ready to share it. As he played, the audience was captivated. The melodies told stories of the streets, of resilience, of hope, and struggle. People listened, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles of admiration. Every note carried the weight of his journey, and the hall filled with the emotion and talent that had once been hidden from the world. The applause at the end was thunderous, not just for the music, but for the man who had reclaimed his life and reminded everyone that talent and perseverance cannot be ignored. The veteran stood, bowing to the audience, feeling a sense of fulfillment and gratitude he had not known in years. The ridicule and indifference of the past seemed distant, replaced by admiration, respect, and connection. He had survived the streets, endured the loneliness, and now, through music, he had found a way to inspire, to reclaim dignity, and to share his story with the world. After the performance, many approached him to express their admiration, some offering support, others simply sharing how much the music had moved them. The veteran listened, nodded, and smiled, feeling a deep sense of human connection. The piano had been his refuge, his companion, and his voice, and now it had become a bridge between him and the world. The journey had been long and difficult, but the outcome was a testament to the power of resilience, talent, and the unwavering spirit of a man who refused to be defined by circumstance. The following days brought more opportunities, invitations to perform, and the chance to rebuild a life that had once seemed lost. The veteran embraced each moment with humility and determination, never forgetting the streets, the ridicule, or the people who had stopped to listen and believe in him when no one else did. The music continued to guide him, a constant reminder that even in the darkest times, there is light, and that human connection, talent, and perseverance can transform lives in ways beyond imagination. In time, the veteran's story became known widely, inspiring countless others. He returned to the subway occasionally, not for survival, but to remind himself of the journey, to play for those who might need hope and inspiration. The piano, once a symbol of survival, became a symbol of transformation, of resilience, and of the enduring power of music. And through it all, the veteran continued to play, to connect, and to show the world that no matter the hardships, dignity, talent, and humanity cannot be silenced.